Okay. Um, Thanks for coming here. Thanks for inviting me to give a talk about an interesting world I live in and work in. Um, Although this is not in space and cosmos and so on, it is from space. And it's about coral reefs in particular. And this is work I'm presenting by lots of people involved, and just recently started with a big project. Why coral habitat? Why is it important? When you think of shops, supermarket, imagine you got 3,000 supermarkets and you want to know the value of those supermarkets. Then if you have the value of one, you get an estimate how much all those supermarkets will cost, but you don't have an exact estimate. On the moment you would know the size of each of those 3,000 supermarkets, you get a better idea. On the moment you would know the shelves and the amount of fridges in those supermarkets, you get a better idea. On the moment you know every single product that is in that supermarket, then you get a really good idea of the value of those supermarkets. And you can get an idea of where to focus your conservation, your protection, or restoration on. And that's what we actually need to know with coral reef habitats. We need to understand where we can protect them best. And you will see throughout my talk, I will provide an input about coral reefs in general, so that I hope to give you an explanation of the work and the importance of these reefs, so that you understand also the processing, how we use satellite imagery and other processes to get to these data sets to help understand coral reefs. And I will put it at the end in a picture of looking at big data sets. So here's the first video.
Coral reefs are found between the latitudes 23.5 degrees north and south of the equator in the relatively clear, shallow waters of the tropical seas. Bathed in sunlight, these waters experience temperatures that range from 18 to 30 degrees Celsius and are characteristically low in nutrients. Reefs are generally found on the eastern sides of continents, where ocean currents, moving from the tropics towards higher latitudes, have a stable salinity and high levels of calcium carbonate. Reefs are made up from the calcareous skeletons of tiny coral polyps, most less than 1 centimetre in size. With countless numbers of polyps living side by side, vast coral reefs are formed into the diverse aquatic superstructures that we see today.
So basically a background of these coral reefs. So if you realize that 1% of the ocean surface is coral reefs, 25% of all marine life originates or is depending on these coral reefs. So on the moment you can take care of that little 1%, you will take care of a large area of the reef or habitat of the reef. Reefs provide enormous services to the local community, as you can see. And it's really important because 500 million people, million people are depending on these reefs, and specifically in developing countries. These reefs form like the dikes and the dunes in Holland. They form in very important structures that protect the countries behind it, the islands behind it. Through sea level rise, through increased storms, there will be challenges with that the reef shape is forming and its protection capability is losing it. It's estimated with a loss of 1 meter of reef top that $4 billion per year would cost for storm damages. Now, as you probably know, is that a lot of reefs are in crisis. In the news, probably you've seen that the Great Barrier Reef is considered dead, which I would completely disagree with, because there's lots of life still on these reefs. But they're threatened, and we need to take care of that. Coral reefs, like I said, is these little polyps which live in symbiosis with zooxanthellae and build up these structures where fishes live and protect. These structures are very important, and these coral habitats you can find in areas where there's specific amount of light, temperature, water chemistry, hard bottom and wave actions. So if you understand the features that biophysical properties that are required for these habitats, then you could start to help understand how to map these areas. Each of these physical attributes influence the shape of corals, like massive, plate, branching and mixed compositions of corals growing on the reef. And each of these types of corals have a different function in a coral reef. You can find them on the different geomorphic zones of a reef. So if you go from the deep water, you get the slope, then the reef crest, then the reef flat, and then the lagoon and the coral cay. Where specifically on the slope and the reef crest, where you will find most live coral and you find most animal life. For the different reef types that occur in the environment, there's different compositions there as well. But they mostly have the same kind of geomorphic zonation. Now, by looking at this reef environment, you look at different spatial scale and different level of details. We look at reef systems, where you see here an example of groups of coral reefs in the Capricorn Bunker group, the southern Great Barrier Reef. And here you look at different reef types, where on the top you maybe have what's called a fringing reef, here lagoonal reefs, and here barrier reefs. Within each of these reefs you can find those different types of area, reef slope till lagoon. And with each of those zones you can find benthic community, which is basically a combination of coral, algae and sand. Now you maybe think, why is he explaining all this? Well, it's a bit, when I came in this morning I realized, ooh, this is a new world for me, which presented. And usually I try to take care that you get on the same line so that you understand the next steps. Because we try to map these environments with satellite imagery. And we use the colors, the texture, the composition, and our knowledge about these systems to map just the reef types, the geomorphic zonation, and the benthic community. We need to understand how remote sensing works from space to looking at the Earth's surface. Of course, we have to understand what's happening with the process through the atmosphere, but in regards to coral reefs, we also have to understand what's happening with when the light signals transfer from the atmosphere into the water column, where light gets absorbed, scattered and refracted as well. And as a result, for instance, long wavelengths don't penetrate the water column. So near infrared maybe goes 1 centimeter deep and then it stops. So it's really limited to the kind of light we can use, which is mainly the visible light. Now it would be easy if everything would stand still and the water is all the same. However, the water is constantly moving up and down because of tides, sideways because of waves, of currents, and the surface area of the ocean is moving as well and has different shapes. As a result, that influences a lot how we can get information from satellite imagery about what's underwater. And obviously if there's clouds, it stops it as well. The different approaches that we use to make maps in generally are pixel-based, where we use spectral signatures from characteristic features, and we assess the satellite imagery to assess every pixel that has the similar, to see what spectral signature it has and label it to a specific class, which is a very common way. However, that's challenged when there's water on top, because the spectral signature will change by the water column. Depth, turbidity will influence that. And then we used object-based. And object-based image analysis is basically the same thing what humans are doing when they interpret an aerial photograph. They start to draw lines on it in their mind and think, oh, that feature is a house. Why is it a house? Because of the shape and the color, the texture. With object-based image analysis, we automatically create segments around features depending on the size, the color, and the texture, and then label those features depending on, again, size, color, and texture, but also the location where it is on a reef, in our case, or based on the biology. We know, for instance, that certain plant material doesn't grow in certain areas of the reef. And then we do continuous biophysical maps, where we basically find a relationship between the pixel values and a biophysical property. An example of that is how we can make maps of water depth using satellite imagery. The type of satellite imagery we use is, first of all, for anything underwater, we have to use the visual bands, but we use different types of imagery, from a very high resolution to very low resolution, for images that cover a small extent to cover an enormous extent. Where the Dove images is very unique, they are from CubeSat satellites. There's about 190 in space at this moment. There's the size a bit bigger than the the size of your microwave, that size. So really small, and they capture images of the Earth's surface on a daily basis, a repeat time. So every part of the Earth's surface is being mapped. Obviously, we'll use drones as well. We can't get around using drones. And that's to highlight specific high-level details in the marine environment. Where we use it is to scale up the field data to an intermediate scale up to the satellite imagery. Now, if we go back to, for instance, the Great Barrier Reef, which, as you know, is, I assume you know, is in Australia, on the east coast of Australia. It's about 3,000 individual reefs. It covers the size of Germany, covering about 2,300 kilometers. The value of the Great Barrier Reef is just recently estimated as 56 billion Australian dollars. It provides an annual income through for Australia and also globally of $6.4 billion, and provides 64,000 full-time jobs. It's one of the biggest employers in the world, you could almost say, in Australia, you could almost say. But then you're amazed if you look at what we know about the Great Barrier Reef. And the highest level of detail is shown here. For every single reef on the Great Barrier Reef, there's an outline of the reef location. And it doesn't show any information of the details of the reef. This detail is completely gone, and you have to imagine that driving on a road map from Groningen to Amsterdam, knowing exactly where the road is, and you can do a really safe passage, but you have no clue if there's towns or if there's forest or anything next to the road. Now, satellite imagery obviously provides a lot of pretty pictures, and anybody looking in Google Earth can travel the world and see these beautiful environments. However, these pretty pictures is not real information yet, because it's only qualitative, it's not quantitative. And the trick is to turn the satellite imagery into quantitative data. Here an example of one of the reefs we work on a lot. It's Heron Reef. It's about 11 by 6 kilometers. If you put that in context to the state of Queensland, which gets mapped land use and land cover on a monthly basis since 1980, using satellite image-based data, which is used by government agency for legislation purpose, then it's unbelievable that that's not equivalent for the GBR present. But if you do a step further, if you look to the global coral reefs, we do know where they are. And there is a mapping event happened in 2010 where they basically combined any data they could find to get one layer to show here in yellow the extent of the different reefs. You see the scale bars, and you see that each of the reefs is differently mapped or represented in level of detail. So although that information is there, and actually there's some reefs that are not mapped, like the one in the middle as well. So although there is some information of the reef, it's not really comparable, and it will provide some challenges with getting good estimates of how our reefs are going. So the aim of the project we're working on is to develop an approach to map large reef systems up to the geomorphic zonation, as you can see in this conceptual model, and the benthic composition, so looking at the coral and algae distribution on these reefs. We started our work on Heron Reef in the southern Great Barrier Reef, and then in 2016 we were fortunate to focus on 20 reefs of that area. In 2017 we actually for the first time were able to focus on 237 reefs. Currently we're working on 3,000 reefs of the Great Barrier Reef to map those. But let's say this month we get sign-off to look at all the reefs in the world and map all the reefs in the world to that level of detail, which, as you can imagine, is a pretty big data set. So the data we were using for the global part is the Planet Dove data, where we have 3.7 meter pixels for every single reef. These images we can get mosaics for almost every month of the year, which is unprecedentedly new for coral reef remote sensing science. The level of detail provided by the images is so big that we really can start to drill into individual areas, reef combinations, like the examples you can see here on the imagery. On the bottom, again, you see Heron Reef, where we basically did most of our work developing it. And Heron Reef is about 70 kilometers offshore, takes about 2 hours by boat to get there, and is a research station. And on an annual basis, we have been going there, and it's one of the longest, let's say, time series analysis of satellite imagery of a coral reef in the world. Now people say, so well, you like diving, and obviously I like diving because I love to be in this environment. And if I want to cover information of one reef or one area, then on one dive, 30 minutes, it takes me about, or it gives me about 500 meters of information, square meters of information. It would take me 3 years to do whole of Heron Reef, which is 28 square kilometers. And it would be even longer if I do it globally. So I try to make the point from we really have to go into space to look at this. But to translate those images into maps, we actually have to smell the reef as well. We still have to go to certain parts of the area to get information of what we're trying to map. And what we're actually doing is using georeference photo transects, where we use a simple camera or on snorkeling or diving or on drones underwater to collect photos at a regular interval, while towing a GPS at the surface that gives us position, because the GPS signal doesn't penetrate the water column. So these photos collected on one 7 to 9 day field trip can be 30 to 50,000 photos, which gives us, of course, an enormous amount of information to translate. And that's, if you do that on an annual basis for each of these reefs, then you get an enormous data set. And just recently, we went on board with a project called CoralNet, where they used machine learning to basically translate each of these photos in meaningful information. Where in the past we would have done this manually, like here an example of 4 years of photo data, about 12,000 photos were analyzed. with 600,000 points on each photo. On all the photos together. That would take us manually about 2,000 hours to analyze. Where now with machine learning we can go up to 100 hours, and we actually can speed it up even better once we use the same camera setup. So as a result of machine learning, we are improving the capability of using photos to look in the environment, but we can also go back with those analysis, because we can do additional questions to the photos to get information about how much coral, algae, or diseases or not disease impacts there are on the image. Art. Here's the next video. Oh. So what you see here is some of the information, or the area we work in. So it forms the Heron Reef is an island or 70 kilometers off the shore of the Great Barrier Reef, and where we go out with boats to the reef sites where we're going to do our surveys. Now, when we do our surveys, where most it's done on scuba or on snorkeling, and we get information about the environment, in not only in regards of what's growing there, but also in the sense of ecology. So we're looking at fish composition, algae composition. We're looking at the three-dimensional structure of the reef, because you can imagine if there's more three-dimensional structure, then fishes, inverts, and little animals prefer to hide out on that reef, because they have a better habitat. Now, once we are done on the reef slopes, we also work on the reef flats. And the interesting thing that the coral reefs are called coral reefs, although most of a coral reef is actually sand. And that's you find on the reef flats. And this area you see taken from a drone, where you see the coral in dense areas, but slowly it goes into areas where it's not so dense. And in those areas you still see a lot of fish and different invertebrates, crabs and shrimps living and being part of. And also there we use three-dimensional mapping to get an idea of the structure of these reefs. Using drones capability, we are able to have a closer look at the reef system under good conditions. And of course, if we are able to georeference the drone images to the satellite images as well. Once we are able to do that, we can get a good view of the different components that make up a reef, but can also zoom in to centimeter level of detail, get an understanding. Now, Heron Reef is a special reef because it has an island on it, but there are, of the 3,000 reefs, there are only a limited amount of islands on there where we can work. So we go back to the presentation. Yep. So with the information that we collect in the field and the satellite imagery and the knowledge about the morphology and the biology of the reefs, we can start to look at modeling the characteristics of reefs. In the first process there, we actually have to process the satellite imagery. We have to set up systems where out of those 190 satellites that go over this CubeSat, we select cloud-free imagery collected at low tide under no wave conditions. So we use all kinds of models to help extract that. Then from these imagery, we actually can derive water depth. And to derive water depth from these imagery, we have to bring the digital numbers of the image back to what we call bottom reflectance. But for each of these steps, we get these different levels of images present. Now, once we have water depth, we actually can with wind data, create wave maps, wave data. And we can get information about the so-called wave height of the reef. And the wave height, as I explained in the beginning, has an influence on how certain coral types grow. So in the past we were focused on satellite and field data, now we actually also introduce physical attributes and are able, with combination of object-based analysis, to derive out of those physical attributes and the imagery and field data these geomorphic maps. And here with object-based image analysis, again, it's the same thing when you look at Google Earth and try to understand what you're seeing in the image. It's a cognitive approach where you basically, in this case, for instance, for the reef crest, we know it's the darkest part of the hard substrate part of a reef, which usually is dark. We know it's the shallowest part of the reef, so we can use depth. We know it's horizontal, so we can use slope. We know it's on the windward side, so we need to use the wave heights. And we know that the reef crest is next to the slope, so we use our understanding of the biology to find out where they are, and our geomorphological knowledge. As a result of setting up these rules for each single pixel or each single object that makes up these reefs, we can make up a map not only of the geomorphic zonation but also the bottom types. With our understanding of bottom types and geomorphic zonation, we can find a relationship between the coral types and the wave heights and model the position of different coral types along the reefs. We can do that for one reef, but actually we can do it for more reefs. So here is an example of the geomorphic map for 20 reefs in the Capricorn Bunker group. Here the bottom type map and the coral type map, but we moved on. So not only for 20 reefs. We got the opportunity to look at 237 reefs in the Cairns region. And to a selected amount of reefs, we went and collected our usual field data, but also collected information through citizen science-based projects, where we got information about the health of the reef as well. The drone information, we try to collect drone data above our photo transects, so the purple lines are the drone data, and we get centimeter level detail. These centimeter level detail, again with object-based analysis, we can provide high-level detail maps that we can use to scale up from our intermediate scale to reef scale. Using the 3 GoPros on a pole, we swim over the reef, or we have drones going over the reefs, collecting 3-dimensional photos. And till a certain extent, my colleague and I were teaching photogrammetry in our remote sensing classes, and we're considering to take it out because it's a bit old school, we thought. But then the whole structure for motion came in, where marine scientists are interested in the 3-dimensional shape of the reef. And through this simple approach with 3 GoPro cameras, we can get really high-level detail, millimeter-level detail of the shape of the reef. So we did that. We collected that field data over 23 reefs out of 237. With that information, we created those rule sets I mentioned before and tried it for the areas where I had field data. Then went to another area where we had field data and adjusted this rule set. And then did it again so that we had a really consistent rule set. But we can't go to every single reef. How much I maybe would like to do that, I can't. So we applied the rule set on a reef by reef basis to every single reef in that area. And as a result, we created these geomorphic maps, so that describe the different zones, but also the bottom type maps and the coral type maps. Now, again, it's a unique situation because that hasn't been done before, where with so little field data, so many reefs have been mapped to that level of detail. And that triggered another project that we were asked to map all the reefs in the world globally. And like I said, it's just we just got to sign off from it happening. So to do that, we need an enormous amount of field data, but again, not from every single reef. Okay. So we collected field data we'll engage the local coral reef community to get this data. And with that field data and our knowledge of different reef systems, we're going to go through the same kind of approach, where on a reef by reef area, we're going to try to develop the rule set, or we are developing the rule set, and then applying that on a reef by reef basis. This project is funded by Vulcan, which is the philanthropic organization from Paul Allen, who was one of the founders of Microsoft. In that same project, we not only look at a one-time step, but we're also monitoring the reef. So there's an even bigger data set coming up, where on a daily basis we look at how the reflectance values of the parts of the reef where there's coral, so the crest and the slope, how they are changing. And if they're constant, then we know the reef is in a good shape. When it suddenly you have a bump, then we know there is a peak, then we know there's bleaching happening. This is with sentinel data, which goes over regularly. But once we use the Planet data, which goes over on a daily basis, we have even more data to work with. So finalizing it, we get to the big data. So obviously, before we worked on our laptop and analyzed imagery, we can't do that anymore, and we now work on cloud computing, where we not only use the high-resolution imagery, but also other data sets to work with, and also physical attributes. The processing step for one reef suddenly increases from pre-processing data sets, increases enormously in the amount of data we have to deal with. And this is one reef, just the digital numbers of raw data is 150 megabytes, which is nothing, of course. But going on, it gets even more. The same with field data. We get gigabytes of field data and processing power we need for machine learning and structure for motion to get this information. So summarizing my talk, I showed you the start of the process of an automated approach to map the coral reefs. We started our work with one reef in Heron and then to 20 reefs in the Capricorn Bunker Group, up to 237 reefs in the GBR and now the full GBR. Where just now we're starting with mapping all the reefs in the world, which will perform an enormous new data set valuable for reef management. And next to that, it will be an enormous amount of computing power needed to assess all those different data sets and combine them to create these maps of coral reefs. So yeah, I acknowledge all the different funding organizations, and if you have questions, you can find my details, and thanks for listening.
We will have one quick question if there's any.
I have a question concerning the visual information that seems to be quite complex. For example, for a man in the dark forest, it's probably easier to look through a thermal signature than a visual signature. So isn't there a way of diluting the information way more if you look on, as you said, other sensors like thermal or sound or specific wavelength reflection? You will have much less information to process.
It would be great, but the thermal data is only from the surface of the ocean and doesn't penetrate. So we would only have from the top millimeters of the surface information about the reef in the thermal sense. Radar data doesn't penetrate. What was the other? Sound, acoustic sound also. If people are using acoustics to start understanding underwater environment, but also that is limited to what you can map as well.
Some specific like spectral window for water, there's nothing in
Infrared doesn't penetrate the water column. We really have to work with the visible, and that's where the challenge is, where we have to, unravel the satellite image using not only the color information but also the textural information and locational information to understand what we see. So we really have to start thinking on how the human brain, and I like Karl-Heinz's talk, how the human brain actually looks at this imagery and understands it.